Russia isn't collapsing, it's being squeezed. Every month, Putin demands more. More soldiers, more shells, more money, more sacrifice. And to get it, he's tightening his grip on everything else. Interest rates of 16%, taxes rising, savings drained, civilian investment frozen. The war machine keeps running, but the rest of the country is gasping for air. This isn't Western sanctions finishing off Russia. It's something far more dangerous. Putin is choking Russia to death, squeezing the last drop of strength out of the economy to keep the war alive. And once there's nothing left to squeeze, there won't be anything left to save. So let's talk about what's really happening inside of Russia right now. Because from the outside, it almost looks like the economy is holding up. GDP hasn't cratered, the ruble hasn't collapsed, defense factories are running triple shifts, cranking out tanks, missiles, and artillery shells faster than at any point since the Soviet era. Manufacturing output in war-linked sectors has been surging. Employment in military-connected regions looks stable, even strong. Kremlin spokesmen still trot out numbers about economic resilience, and international headlines still credit Russia with somehow dodging the worst of Western sanctions. And that's exactly the illusion that Putin wants you to see. Because behind those reassuring figures is a very different picture, one that doesn't show up in GDP headlines or state-controlled news broadcasts. The true state of Russia's economy is visible only when you look at where the money actually goes, what it's doing to the people who live there, and what it means for the decade ahead. In 2024, Russia poured an estimated $149 billion into its military, a staggering 38% jump from the year before, and more than double what it was spending in 2021 before the full-scale invasion. According to SIPRI, that brought military expenditure to roughly 7.1% of GDP, a war footing not seen since the Cold War. The planned budget for 2025 pushed even further, 15.5 trillion rubles, approximately 7.2% of GDP. And the growing share of that spending now sits outside the official national defense budget line, tucked into social support programs, regional transfers, and classified categories, making the true scale of military expenditure increasingly impossible to pin down. The war economy has its own gravitational pull, and it's dragging everything toward it. Defense factories are operating around the clock, missile production lines hum through the night, signing bonuses for new recruits are so massive that regional governments are going into debt just to cover them. One analysis estimated that Russia spent roughly 2 trillion rubles on signing bonuses, military salaries, and compensation for the wounded and dead in just the first half of 2025 alone, a third more than that same period a year earlier. That's money that could have built hospitals, funded research, or kept small businesses alive. But instead, it feeds the machine. And here's the dark irony. The regions flush with war-linked wages get recorded as income growth. An arms factory running 3 shifts counts as output. Look, on paper, the numbers look fine, but these aren't the building blocks of a real economy. They're the symptoms of a state that's converting its future into ammunition. And meanwhile, on the civilian side, a completely different reality. The OSW Center for Eastern Studies, one of the most respected Russia watchers in Europe, documented exactly this split. While defense-linked manufacturing posted double-digit growth, the broader economy struggled under shortages, disrupted supply chains, and rising costs. Wages were climbing, yes, but driven by a desperate labor crunch, not by genuine productivity. Workers who might have been engineers or teachers or factory supervisors are being siphoned into the war machine instead. The economy is running hot in one narrow corridor and then freezing everywhere else. Russia looks strong because it's burning its future to power the present. But war booms don't create wealth, they redirect it. And the cost of that redirection is about to become devastatingly clear. Because here's the contradiction at the heart of the Russian economy, and it's the one that the Kremlin cannot escape. When you pour trillions of rubles into war production, you flood the economy with demand. Workers get paid more, factories compete for scarce labor, prices start climbing, inflation rises. That's exactly what happened. Consumer price inflation surged close to 10% in 2024, and by October of that year, the central bank had been forced to hike interest rates all the way to 21%, the highest in more than 2 decades. To understand why that matters so deeply in Russia, you have to understand what inflation represents here. Not just an economic statistic, but a national trauma. In the early 1990s, after the Soviet collapse, Russia experienced hyperinflation that far exceeded 1,500% in a single year. Annual inflation was approximately 2,500% in 1992 and remained high for several years. Savings were destroyed overnight. Pensions became worthless. Wages couldn't keep pace with prices. State legitimacy disintegrated in real time. For an entire generation, inflation didn't just erode wealth, it shattered the basic promise that the state would protect what you earned. That memory is seared into the national psyche, and the Kremlin knows it. Visible, runaway inflation is one of the fastest ways to lose the consent of the governed. And it's not a statistic in Russia, it's a political tripwire. So when prices started climbing again, the central bank did what it always does. It tightened hard. Interest rates rocketed upward. Credit became prohibitively expensive. Borrowing froze. The bank's own reports confirmed that mechanism. High interest rates deliberately discourage households from purchasing non-food goods on credit, cooling demand by making it painful to spend. The ruble strengthened partly because tight monetary policy made holding rubles attractive, which stabilized import prices and helped slow inflation through the exchange rate channel. But that's exactly where the trap snapped shut. You can't fight inflation by making money expensive and keep pumping trillions into war spending at the same time. It's like slamming the brake and the accelerator together. The engine doesn't know what to do, but something is going to break. The central bank is trying to cool the economy while the Kremlin keeps pouring fuel on it. And the only thing that actually gets crushed between those two forces is the civilian economy, the part of Russia that ordinary people live in. Small businesses can't get loans. Consumer credit has dried up. Mortgage rates are punishing. Investment in anything not connected to the war effort has essentially been paralyzed since the invasion. The Bank of Finland's forecast is blunt. Russia's realistic growth ceiling is stuck around 1% per year because labor shortages and capacity constraints are already binding. Growth beyond that would require massive productivity gains, and those are nearly impossible when the overwhelming majority of new investment gets funneled into military sectors with zero civilian return. Russia managed just 1% GDP growth in 2025, down sharply from the war-fueled surge of previous years. And Putin himself admitted that the slowdown was deliberate, a consequence of targeted measures to fight inflation. Think about that for a moment. The president of Russia is publicly accepting near zero growth as the price of keeping prices stable. That's not a sign of strength. That's the sound of an economy that has run out of room to do two things at once. And for ordinary Russians, the squeeze is brutally real. The cost of groceries has been climbing steadily. Housing is increasingly unaffordable as mortgage rates soar. The gap between what people earn and what things cost keeps widening, and there's no relief in sight. The central bank has made it clear that tight conditions will persist through 2026, projecting average key rates between 13.5% and 14.5%. That means another full year of suffocating credit, suppressed demand, and frozen civilian ambition. Inflation is being defeated by freezing everything that isn't war. But here's what makes this truly dangerous. When oil can't fund the war anymore, someone else has to pay. And right now, that someone is the Russian people. If you want to understand how powerful states really fall, not in explosions, but in slow suffocation, make sure to subscribe to Fall of Nations and hit that notification bell. Because what's unfolding inside Russia right now is more dangerous than any single economic crash. Here's why. Russia's oil and gas revenues, the lifeblood of the federal budget for decades, are in freefall. In January of 2026 alone, energy income plummeted 50% year on year, crashing to a 5-year low of just 393 billion rubles. Total budget revenues dropped nearly 12%. And despite a value-added tax hike to 22% that kicked in on January 1st, boosting value-added tax receipts by almost 25%, that wasn't remotely enough to offset the hemorrhaging in energy income. The January deficit hit 1.718 trillion rubles, roughly $22 billion. That's just a single month. And here's the number that should make anyone watching sit up straight. That 1 month shortfall was nearly half of Russia's entire planned deficit for the full year of 2026. The government's annual target was 3.8 trillion rubles. They burned through almost half of it before February even started. And according to a government source cited by Reuters, if oil prices don't recover, the actual deficit could reach 3.5% to 4.4% of GDP, nearly triple the official plan. The full year 2025 deficit was even worse, 5.65 trillion rubles, the largest annual shortfall since at least 1996. Oil and gas revenues dropped 24% for the year, hitting a 5-year low, while spending rose nearly 7%. The government had to revise its deficit target upward twice after the original goal of just 0.5% of GDP became completely unrealistic. So where does all that money come from when the oil dries up? The National Wealth Fund. Russia's sovereign safety net built over years of high commodity prices. As of February 1st, total fund assets stood at 13.64 trillion rubles, about $177 billion. That sounds substantial, but the liquid portion, the cash that can actually be tapped fast, was just 4.23 trillion rubles, roughly $55 billion. Before the invasion, liquid reserves stood at over $113 billion, but they've been cut by more than half in less than 4 years. And they keep draining it. In January alone, the government sold yuan and gold from the fund to plug the budget hole. Economists from Russia's own presidential academy have warned that the fund's liquid assets could be fully exhausted by the end of 2026. Gazprombank's forecasting unit has projected that at current oil prices, the fund would last about a year. And once those liquid reserves are gone, well, the government faces an ugly choice. It can borrow domestically, but in a high-rate environment, the cost of that borrowing is enormous, and it risks crowding out what little private investment remains, or it can lean on the central bank to effectively just print money, which is precisely the playbook that Russia used in the 1990s, the one that produced the hyperinflation seared into the nation's memory. Either path risks reigniting the very price spiral that they've spent 2 years trying to crush. The safety net is turning into a trap. The state is turning inward, extracting from its own citizens to keep the machine funded. Corporate profit tax went from 20 to 25%. VAT jumped 2 full points. Regional governments are cutting services and slashing civil servant pay. One prominent economist warned that in a worsening scenario, household incomes would be among the very first targets for new extraction. When oil can't pay for war, the people do. But even that isn't enough, because Russia isn't just spending more, it's consuming itself. This is the concept that most analysts miss. Russia isn't heading for a dramatic, explosive crash. What it's entering is something far more insidious, what mountaineers call the death zone. Above 8,000 meters on Everest, the human body can still function, but only by burning itself faster than it can regenerate. Muscles break down, organs strain, blood thickens. The climber keeps moving, keeps breathing, but every step comes at a biological cost that the body cannot sustain indefinitely. Without descent, death is not a question of if, it's a question of when. That is Russia's economy right now. The factories are open, the missiles keep firing, the currency holds. Inflation is slowly being wrestled downward. The central bank recently cut rates to 15.5% and forecasts inflation falling toward 4.5% to 5.5% by year end. On the surface, it looks like a managed survival, but underneath, every pillar of long-term strength is being hollowed out. Civilian investment has been crushed by years of sky-high interest rates. Labor shortages are so severe that capacity utilization sits at historic highs. Not because the economy's booming, but because there's physically no room to expand without reigniting price spirals. Industrial output actually slipped into decline in late 2025, with manufacturing output contracting for the first time since early 2023. The economy has stalled, and the only thing still growing is the war budget. Russia is surviving at altitude, but it's surviving by eating itself. The social dynamics are just as telling. The mood the Kremlin fears most isn't poverty, it's volatility. Russians will tolerate many forms of tightening, so long as prices don't appear to run away. That's why inflation targeting has become political doctrine. But maintaining that illusion of control requires keeping hardship slow, incremental, and deniable. A managed constriction rather than a visible crash. The state isn't just fighting an economic war, it's fighting a perception war against its own population. And so far, it's winning that fight. But only by narrowing the corridor of options further with every passing month. And the corridor of choices keeps narrowing every quarter. The current account surplus, once a towering source of financial resilience, is evaporating. From double-digit levels during the early sanctions era, it's projected to slide to barely 1.6% of GDP. That vanishing surplus means less foreign exchange, less cushion against shocks, and less ability to finance the imported components that Russia's defense industry still quietly depends on. External debt has hit a 20-year high as Moscow burns more aggressively just to keep the lights on. Total consolidated internal debt has ballooned to nearly 35 trillion rubles, and the government continues issuing high-yield federal bonds to cover the gap. In a high-rate environment, servicing those debts eats up an ever-growing slice of revenue, money that's being burned just to pay interest rather than building anything. The budget is becoming a machine that exists primarily to service itself and fund the war, with less and less left over for everything else. There's a historical parallel here that no one in the Kremlin wants to hear, but it's impossible to ignore. The Soviet war in Afghanistan, a conflict that ground on for nearly a decade, chewed through resources, eroded military credibility, and quietly hollowed out a system that was already stagnating. About 15,000 Soviet soldiers came home in coffins. But the real damage, it wasn't even the body count. It was what the war did to the economy underneath. A prolonged conflict with limited strategic returns, far from Moscow, increasingly expensive to sustain, eroding confidence at home year after year, draining resources from a civilian economy that desperately needed investment. By the time the withdrawal came, the economic foundations had already rotted past the point of repair. Russia today is not the late Soviet Union. Its debt is lower. Its central bank is more technically competent. Its instruments of control are sharper, but the structural rhythm is unmistakable. A long war transforms the economy, sustaining it in ways that become almost impossible to reverse, especially when those transformations are paired with shrinking transparency, rising secrecy, and an investment climate dominated entirely by political risk. And that brings us to the part nobody in Moscow wants to confront. This war hasn't just drained Russia's reserves, it rewired the entire state in ways that will haunt the country for decades after the last shell is fired. 30% of all federal budget items are now classified, hidden behind walls of secrecy that even experienced independent Russian economists can't penetrate. A RAND analysis of Russia's federal budget flagged the rising share of classified spending and declining analytical visibility as defining features of the wartime fiscal state. An economy optimized for secrecy and mobilization forgets how to grow. When the state funnels most new investment into weapons production and war infrastructure, it crowds out everything that builds real national power: innovation, technology, civilian industry, education, research. Now, foreign companies have left. Domestic entrepreneurs face borrowing costs that make expansion unthinkable. The best and brightest are either feeding the machine or leaving the country. And the institutions that might normally correct these distortions, competitive markets, open data, independent courts, transparent governance, well, they've been systematically weakened in favor of centralized control. This is the end-stage risk that historians will write about. Once a system becomes fully optimized for secrecy, mobilization, and short-term fiscal survival, it loses the capacity to do what actual development requires: open competition, long-horizon investment, and trust in rules that outlast any single leader's priorities. Russia is not just spending down its reserves, it's spending down the institutional capital that would be needed to rebuild after the war ends. Every classified budget line, every silenced economist, every startup that never launched because the interest rate was 20%. Those are the invisible costs that compound year after year. Putin built stability, but it's a stability at altitude, and that air is running out. So here's where Russia stands now. The factories are still running, the missiles still fire, the ruble is still trading, and inflation is slowly coming back under control. But the civilian economy is suffocating. Investment is frozen. Reserves are thinning. Oil revenues are collapsing. Deficits are widening. Taxes are climbing. The best minds are leaving. And with every quarter, the state reaches deeper into its own people's pockets to fund a war they didn't choose and cannot question. Russia isn't dying in a blaze of fire. It's being squeezed. Budget by budget, rate hike by rate hike, tax increase by tax increase. Putin wanted control, and he got it. But control at this altitude, it doesn't build nations. It consumes them. And when there's nothing left to squeeze, the collapse won't be sudden. It simply will be undeniable. So what do you think? Can Russia keep surviving in the death zone, or has Putin already squeezed out the last drop? Let us know in the comments, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because this story is far from over.